A soldier and his war dog moved silently, tracking something unseen. Then, footprints, tiny ones, leading into the trees. They found her, 5 years old, pink dress, bare hands clutching a torn doll. No name, no voice, just eyes, frozen with terror. And somewhere in the dark, the man who left her there was still watching. The soldier took 1 step forward. The dog growled low. What happened next would test their faith and their lives. The snow had been falling for hours, thick and unrelenting, covering everything in a white shroud that seemed to mute even the thoughts inside a man's head. North Hollow, a remote town tucked against the Montana-Canada border, sat smothered in silence. Streets were buried under drifts waist-deep. Power lines sagged like tired arms. The only sound was the occasional groan of pine trees bending under ice, or the whimpering wind as it slipped through cracked shutters and hollow barns. It was the kind of winter that didn't just challenge your body, it tested your soul. And James Walker's soul had already been tested too many times. He trudged through the knee-high snow behind his old log cabin, the beam of his flashlight shaking slightly in his gloved hand. Tall and wiry, James was the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved out of lean timber. His angular jawline bore a permanent shadow of stubble, and a thin scar ran from the corner of his left eyebrow down to his cheek, a souvenir from a roadside IED in Kandahar. His nose had been broken once, maybe twice. His dark green eyes, sharp but distant, rarely made contact for more than a few seconds, like they were always somewhere else. James was 40, but the war had added a decade to his posture. He walked like a man who didn't expect rest, only delay. Each night he barely slept, haunted by dreams that bled into his waking hours. Night patrols had become his ritual, an old soldier's habit he couldn't shake. Not even in peacetime, not even in snowstorms. Beside him moved a darker figure, his shadow and also his anchor. Shadow was a Belgian Malinois, 9 years old, sleek and muscular, with fur the color of wet ash. His eyes were golden and intelligent, scanning the horizon even when his body appeared still. His ears were always perked, his tail rarely wagged. Unlike civilian dogs, Shadow didn't play. He calculated, he waited, he remembered. They had served together in the military, a K-9 unit bonded by routine and chaos, by blood and instinct. Shadow had sniffed out explosives, tracked wounded men, lunged into the fire James couldn't. And when the war ended, when the uniform came off and the parades stopped, Shadow came home with him. The only constant that made sense in a world too quiet. Tonight, like every night, they were patrolling the edge of the forest, where snow met timber and the wind howled like it had unfinished business. James adjusted his coat collar higher, squinting against the gusts. "Come on, boy," he muttered through chapped lips. Shadow didn't respond, but he didn't need to. Then suddenly, movement. The dog froze, one paw suspended in the air. His ears tilted forward, eyes locked on something in the distance. He let out a low growl, barely audible, but enough to turn James's body rigid. "What is it?" James whispered, instinctively reaching for the sidearm he no longer carried. Shadow bolted, leaving a spray of snow behind him. "Shadow!" James called, heart hammering as he gave chase. They darted between snow-heavy branches and low-hanging limbs, James slipping, cursing, pushing through ice and panic. Shadow had never broken protocol, not without reason. That reason was sitting against the base of a pine tree, arms wrapped around trembling knees, barely visible beneath a thick crust of snow. A child. James skidded to a stop, breath misting in the frigid air. She couldn't have been older than 5. Her golden hair was tangled, knotted in frozen strands, and her cheeks were raw from wind. She wore a thin pink dress, entirely unsuited for the weather, and her fingers were curled into purple claws from the cold. A frayed stuffed rabbit lay beside her in the snow, soaked and stiff. But what struck James the hardest weren't the frost-bitten limbs or the wild eyes. It was how quiet she was. No screaming, no crying, just wide, pale blue eyes looking directly at Shadow, not James, and she didn't blink. Shadow approached slowly, ears still up, his steps light and measured. The girl didn't flinch. In fact, her tiny lips parted as if in recognition. James knelt down, keeping his voice low. "Hey! Hey there, little one!" No response. Just that same hollow gaze. "Where are your parents?" he asked. "Did you get lost?" Still nothing. Shadow sat down beside her and slowly lowered his head until his snout touched her knee. The girl blinked for the first time and reached out a shaking hand to rest it on the dog's head. Her fingers sank into the fur, and her lips quivered. Then she exhaled. A slow, fragile breath, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. James felt something tighten in his chest, something he hadn't felt since the war. "I'm going to get you out of here," he murmured. He unzipped his coat and wrapped it around the girl's small body. She didn't resist. He lifted her carefully into his arms. She weighed less than his backpack, but she clung to Shadow's gaze until the last moment, before her head dropped onto his shoulder. As they turned back toward the cabin, Shadow trailing close, James whispered, "You're safe now." But even he wasn't sure that was true. North Hollow remained locked beneath a ceiling of gray, its snow-covered streets silenced by the relentless winter that had arrived early and refused to let go. Frost clung to every window pane like breath held too long. The sun hadn't fully risen in 2 days. Only a pale light seeped through the clouds, casting the town in an eternal half-mourning. The wind whispered ceaselessly along the mountain slopes, pushing against cabin walls like a hungry ghost searching for warmth. Inside one such cabin, tucked between a frozen creek and a slope of pine, the fire crackled softly, battling the chill that crept in through every knot in the log walls. James Walker sat cross-legged near the hearth, a wool blanket wrapped around his shoulders. His dark green eyes, weary but watchful, stayed fixed on the girl asleep on the cot across the room. She hadn't spoken since he brought her in 2 nights ago. Not a word, not a sound, just a silent shivers and wide, haunted eyes. She still wore the same tattered pink dress, now layered beneath one of James's old flannel shirts. The sleeves swallowed her small arms. Her golden hair, damp and tangled, lay spread across the pillow like sunlight trapped in storm clouds. The only thing she held onto was the battered stuffed rabbit he'd found beside her. One ear missing, stuffing leaking from the side. She clutched it like it was the last piece of someone she had once known. James watched her breathe. Her chest rose and fell in shallow rhythms. He'd seen men breathe like that before, children too, intense, stained with dust and trauma halfway across the world. The girl hadn't cried. That's what unnerved him most. Kids were supposed to cry. He would have felt better if she screamed or even kicked, but she simply watched and waited. Shadow lay curled at the foot of the cot, eyes half-lidded but alert. Every so often he'd shift slightly, inching closer to her, as if responding to a sound only he could hear. The girl had not spoken to James, but she had responded to Shadow. She had reached for him, leaned into his warmth, even buried her face into the thick ruff of his neck when she slept. That simple act had told James more than words ever could. She trusted the dog, and Shadow, always the professional, had accepted the role without hesitation. James stirred the fire absently. The kindling popped. Smoke twisted upward into the chimney. He was still trying to piece it all together. Who left her out there? Why that remote section of forest? Had they expected her to die quietly, vanish beneath snow? Or had she escaped? He shook the thought away, rising stiffly to his feet. His long frame unfolded with effort, muscles tight from cold and unease. His flannel shirt hung loose on his thin frame, the fabric worn at the cuffs. He poured hot water into a chipped mug, added a spoonful of cocoa mix, and stood there staring at it for a moment, steam rising like the breath of some restless ghost. He remembered Amaya's voice, soft and laughing. Claire, his fiancée, from a life that now felt like a rumor. She had been slender, graceful in that way school teachers sometimes were, with light brown hair always pulled back, and a kindness in her hazel eyes that never dimmed even when she was angry. Before his last deployment, they had sat in this very cabin, the one James had inherited from his grandfather, and she had told him, curled beneath the blanket, "If we ever have a daughter, I want to name her Rose, because roses have thorns, but they're still beautiful. I want our girl to be like that, beautiful, strong, and impossible to break." James hadn't let himself think about Claire in years. After the convoy ambush that left his unit torn and bleeding, after the letter from her sister telling him Claire had died in a car accident 3 weeks before his return. Well, there hadn't been space left inside him for roses. But now, standing here in this same cabin, firelight flickering on rough-hewn walls, with a silent girl sleeping just a few feet away, something shifted. He turned and walked over to her quietly. Shadow lifted his head but didn't move. The girl's fingers twitched against the rabbit's torn ear. Her lips were parted slightly, a smear of dried blood still visible at the corner from where she'd bitten them in the cold. James knelt beside her, lowering himself carefully so he wouldn't wake her. For a moment he simply watched. Then softly, more to the air than to her, he whispered, "Rose." The girl stirred, her brow furrowed slightly. Then her eyes opened, and she looked straight at him. James held her gaze. "That's a good name for you," he said. "You look like someone who fights, even when it hurts." Her eyes didn't leave his, but something flickered across her face, a hesitation, a question. Shadow sat up fully now, ears twitching. James smiled gently. "Can I call you Rose?" The girl didn't speak, but her lips curled, just barely, into something that might have been a smile. Then she reached out, not toward James, but toward Shadow, placing her small hand on his shoulder. And James understood. That was her yes. He exhaled. Something in his chest loosened for the first time in days. "Okay then," he said. "Welcome home, Rose." Snowfall had slowed, but not ceased. In North Hollow, winter did not retreat. It only paused to take a breath before settling deeper into the bones of the land. The sky was a pale, flat gray. An unfurnished ceiling stretched over a world gone white. The snow crunched dryly under boots now, brittle with a layer of overnight frost. James Walker stood just outside his cabin, shovel in hand, clearing a path, not because he needed it, but because doing something kept the ghosts at bay. The cold bit at the edges of his face, but he welcomed it. Pain, at least, reminded him he was still here. Inside, Rose was drawing. She sat cross-legged on the worn wooden floor, surrounded by a blanket cocoon. A thick wool hat nearly swallowed her head, and the sleeves of James's oversized flannel still draped past her fingertips. A small box of colored pencils, unearthed from a forgotten drawer in the kitchen, lay beside her. She held a red one clumsily in her left hand, tongue pressed to her upper lip as she worked. Shadow lay nearby, his chin resting across his front paws, golden eyes tracking her every motion like a sentry. It had been 4 days since James found her in the woods. Rose had started speaking the day before, not in full sentences, not quite, but fragments, colors, names, shapes, enough to plant seeds of memory. When James returned inside and pulled off his gloves, Rose looked up at him without fear. "You're cold," she said softly, then went back to her drawing. Her voice was high and quiet, but steadier now. James crouched down. "What are you making today?" She turned the paper toward him. It showed a small wooden house with a red door, a mountain in the background, and stick trees beside it. To the right was a tall figure with dark glasses drawn in harsh black strokes. The man had no smile. His mouth was a flat line. "That's someone you knew?" James asked carefully. Rose nodded. "And this house? It's where you lived?" Her finger moved from the house to another drawing on the same page, a dark rectangle with no windows, just a small square at the top that looked like a vent. "They put us there," she said, the color draining from her voice. James felt something heavy sink inside him. "Us?" She hesitated, then added, "Other kids. Not nice there." Shadow rose, padding over to rest his head on her knee. She leaned into him without thinking, burying her hand in the thick fur at his neck. James stood and poured himself coffee. His hands trembled slightly as he held the mug. Rose's drawings weren't just imagination. They were memories. And the figure with the dark glasses, that was a face from her past. Maybe someone still out there. Later that afternoon, James and Shadow prepared to head out. The sun was low but steady, casting an eerie yellow light over the whitened landscape. Rose remained inside with a thermos of soup and a stack of blankets. James had shown her how to lock the door and promised to be gone only a few hours. They hiked toward the ridge where the mountains began to swell. James carried a backpack with rations, rope, and his old military flashlight. Shadow moved ahead, nose low, tail high, ears flicking at the faintest sound. For nearly 2 hours they searched. Forest paths, abandoned trails, snow-covered deer tracks. James was about to turn back when Shadow stopped cold. The dog lowered his snout to a cluster of shrubs poking out from the snow and gave a low, growling whine. James moved in. There, half buried beneath a collapsed branch, was a scrap of cloth. He reached down, pulled it free, and shook it clean. It was a child's handkerchief. Dirty, torn at one edge, and embroidered in one corner with a single letter. R. James stared at the fabric. It could be coincidence, but in his gut, he knew better. Shadow surged forward again, pawing at the snow ahead. James followed, and soon they emerged into a clearing, wide and quiet, surrounded by thick trees. At the far end stood a building, its roof sagging, windows broken, the paint peeled and sun-bleached. An old hunting lodge by the look of it. James approached slowly, flashlight out. He stepped carefully over fallen planks and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with mildew. Dust danced in the narrow shafts of light. A row of old cots lined one wall, and the remains of wire mesh hung from windows, as if someone had tried to block the view in or out. Shadow sniffed near a corner and suddenly let out a sharp bark. James hurried over. There, beneath a broken crate, was a dried stain on the floor. Dark brown, ringed at the edges. Blood, old, but human. James took out his phone and snapped a photo. He explored further, noting rusted locks, bits of torn fabric, child-sized shoes, scattered and mismatched. A sense of dread settled over him like the cold. Someone had used this place, not for hunting, but for hiding, for keeping. The kind of keeping that made your stomach turn. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, they started back. James's mind raced. Was the man in the drawing real? Was Rose's memory accurate? And most importantly, were there still children out there? That night he couldn't sleep. The images from the lodge swirled in his head, layered with memories he thought long buried. Young faces in war zones, villages flattened, orders ignored, and regrets sharpened like knives. He lay on his back in the dark, staring at the ceiling. In the corner, Rose slept. One hand curled around Shadow's fur. Her breathing was soft, but each rise and fall of her chest felt like a question. Who could abandon her, and why? The blizzard had passed, but North Hollow remained locked in silence. The town sat under a thick white shroud, rooftops sloping with heavy snow, the air thin and painfully dry. Trees looked like skeletal arms draped in cotton. Smoke rose in thin ribbons from a few stubborn chimneys, the only sign that life continued. For James Walker, the cabin had become a liminal space, not quite part of the town, not quite apart from it either. Just like him. Inside, the fire crackled low. Rose sat by the window, her legs tucked beneath a handmade quilt, coloring again. Her movements were quiet, her posture stiff with focus. Her blonde hair was brushed now. James had found a comb and gently untangled it the night before. But it still fell unevenly across her shoulders. Her pink cheeks had regained a little warmth, but her eyes still carried that glassy look of someone who had seen too much. Shadow lay nearby, her ears twitching now and then, his golden eyes fixed not on the window, but on her. James watched from the table, where an open notebook held sketches and notes, his attempts to piece together Rose's story. Over the past few days, her drawings had evolved. They had shape, direction, and memory. She handed him a page with her small hand. "This one is from before," she said quietly. James studied the drawing. A cabin again, but smaller than his. There was a woman with long brown hair standing in the doorway. Rose had drawn herself beside her. Stick figures, crude but clear. A line of snow falling between them and two dark figures approaching from the background, stick arms outstretched. "She called me Little Star," Rose whispered. "Only her." James looked up. "Who was she, Rose?" "My mommy," the girl said. Her voice trembled. "Her name was Emily." The name hit him with surprising force. There was something haunting about hearing it said aloud. Something final. Emily. A real person. Not just a memory. Not just a blur. Now she had a name. A history. A place in the puzzle. "She told me to hide. They took her," Rose said. "In the snow. They had a loud truck and big lights." James reached across the table and took her hand. Gently. "You were very brave," he said. Rose didn't reply. Instead, she slid off the bench and crossed the room to where Shadow lay. The dog lifted his head immediately and sniffed the air around her as if checking her for harm. Rose pressed her forehead to his and exhaled. Shadow's tail gave a soft thump. Later that night, as James studied the map of the region spread across his kitchen table, Shadow suddenly growled, low and deep, a warning sound James hadn't heard in years. The dog stood, stiff-legged, moving to the door. He sniffed at the seams, then backed up, staring at the wood like it had whispered something unholy. James approached. "What is it, boy?" Shadow didn't move. James opened the door and stepped outside, flashlight in hand. The cold slapped him. Immediately, but he welcomed it. He scanned the snow. Nothing unusual. The forest beyond looked as still as ever. But Shadow didn't relax. The dog circled the perimeter of the cabin twice that night, his body low, every movement sharp. At one point he paused and sniffed near the back shed, then released a quiet whine, the kind he made when something felt familiar but wrong. James didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat by the window, rifle across his lap. Shadow curled at his feet. Rose slept in the corner, curled under the thickest blankets they had. She didn't stir, but James couldn't ignore what he saw in Shadow. Something primal, a hunter's tension. The next morning, James did what logic told him he shouldn't. He called the sheriff's office in town. The voice that answered belonged to Deputy Glenn Rourke, a man James had served with briefly years ago. Glenn was in his mid-50s, round-bellied and thick-armed, with a thinning patch of brown hair combed carefully to one side. He had once been a capable soldier, but years behind a desk and behind the wheel of a patrol car had dulled his edges. "Walker," Glenn said with surprise, "didn't think I'd ever hear from you again. I need to report something, possibly criminal." "You? Reporting crime?" Glenn chuckled. "World's upside down." James ignored the joke. "There's a girl, about 5, found her alone in the forest. Says her mother, Emily, was taken. Drawings suggest a group of men, possibly a compound." There was a pause. "And you didn't report this earlier because—" "She wasn't talking, and I didn't have enough. Now I do. Where is she now?" "She's safe," Glenn sighed. "Look, James, we've had no missing person report for anyone named Emily or matching your girl's description. Not in this county or adjacent ones. You sure this isn't PTSD twisting things around?" James stiffened. "Number I'm sure. I'll run a check. But off the record, we've had 2 calls in the last week from hikers saying they saw flashlights moving through the woods after midnight. Might be nothing, might be hunters, but you might not be the only one seeing things." James hung up without saying goodbye. He returned inside and saw Rose coloring again. This time a new page. A tall man, sunglasses, big hands, and a necklace, a large silver cross on his chest. "Do you remember his name?" James asked softly. Rose hesitated. "He was called Mr., but not in a nice way." Shadow moved closer to the picture and sniffed it, as if the image itself carried a scent. Then he let out a short bark and stared at James. No one else believed the girl, but Shadow did. And James trusted Shadow more than any man alive. The snow had hardened into a crusty shell over North Hollow. Each step cracked the surface like breaking old glass. Clouds hung low in the sky, dimming the world with a gray so deep it blurred the lines between afternoon and dusk. In the distance, Mount Ellery loomed silent, its slope blanketed with evergreen forests now laced with suspicion. Nothing in the wind sang any more, only whispered. James Walker pulled the collar of his coat higher and adjusted the strap of his rifle across his back. Shadow moved ahead, weaving through the trees, each paw fall calculated and silent. They were back near the old hunting lodge, the one Rose's drawings had led them to. James hadn't stopped thinking about that place since the last visit, and something in his gut told him it wasn't abandoned anymore. Rose had stayed back at the cabin with a neighbor named Helen Wilcox, a widow in her late 60s who lived a few miles down the slope. Helen was a tall, wiry woman with a shock of white hair, always tied in a bun, and a pair of spectacles perched permanently on the tip of her nose. Her voice was stern but not unkind, and her late husband had been a ranger, so she knew the woods better than most. She had offered to watch Rose without hesitation, saying, "She deserves a safe place, and you need your hands free if something goes wrong." Now James moved with careful purpose. Snow crunched softly beneath his boots. The lodge came into view, but it wasn't silent anymore. Voices. He crouched behind a pine trunk, raising binoculars. There were 3 men, strangers. One stood on the porch, kicking aside a broken chair. Another hauled something heavy, maybe crates or equipment, into the back of a dark-colored SUV with no plates. The third paced nervously, smoking, eyes flicking toward the woods. James studied them. The first man was tall, muscular, with a shaved head and a thick black parka. His nose had been broken before and never set right. His movements were methodical, dangerous. The second was younger, maybe mid-30s, with a wiry frame, a sharp jawline, and a jittery energy. He wore mirrored sunglasses despite the low light. The third was stocky, with greasy blonde hair and a poorly hidden limp. His coat bore a stitched patch, the kind used at state prisons. None of them belonged here. James clicked his tongue. Shadow tensed beside him, low to the ground. "We're not going loud, unless we have to," James whispered. He pulled out his phone, took several pictures, then pocketed it. Just as he turned to backtrack, a branch snapped behind him. Before he could fully react, a fourth man, previously unseen, tackled him from the side. James hit the ground hard, snow smashing against his face. The man on top of him was younger, heavier, with a buzz cut and bad breath. He swung once, grazing James's cheek. But James fought back with soldier instinct, elbowing the attacker in the ribs and rolling free. Shadow charged in with a snarl, launching at the man and sinking his teeth into the attacker's forearm. The scream tore through the trees. "Shadow down!" James barked. The dog released instantly, retreating to James's side. The commotion had drawn the attention of the 3 others. They came running, guns out, shouting. James raised his rifle, aimed once, then fired a warning shot into the snow between them. "Back off!" he shouted. They stopped, hands halfway raised, not from fear but calculation. The bald one smiled coldly. "You shouldn't be here, Walker." James's blood froze. "How do you know my name?" No answer. The man gestured, and the group began retreating, quick, controlled. Within seconds they were in the SUV, engine roaring, tires skidding over packed snow as they disappeared down a forest path. James didn't give chase. He stood, chest heaving, cheek bleeding from a shallow cut, and looked down at the attacker Shadow had bitten. The man was gone, retreated while James had aimed at the others. Shadow stood alert, tail stiff, breath fogging the air. They were being watched. That night James returned to the cabin just past nightfall. He found Helen reading beside the fire, her glasses tipped low on her nose. Rose sat curled on the couch, blanket tucked under her chin, coloring again. James nodded his thanks to Helen, who gathered her coat and offered a silent squeeze to his arm before leaving. When the door clicked shut, James sat across from Rose. Shadow lay beside her, tail slowly tapping the rug. Rose looked up, eyes wide. "You got hurt," she said, pointing to the dried blood on his cheek. "I'm okay," James replied. Shadow made sure of it. She reached out and touched the dog's ears. "Did he scare them?" James nodded. "Yeah, he scared them real good." Rose was quiet for a moment. Then she whispered, "He always protects me." James stared into the fire, jaw tight. He thought of the men, the SUV, the recognition in their eyes. They weren't strangers, at least not to this. Whatever was happening, whatever Rose had survived, wasn't over. They were coming back, maybe not tonight, but soon. He looked at the girl, Rose with her drawings and her quiet courage, a child left in the snow like a piece of trash. No, not trash, like a secret someone didn't want found. And then he looked at Shadow. The dog had placed himself between danger and that child without hesitation, without command. There had been fire in his eyes, not just instinct, but purpose. James rose and walked to the kitchen window, looking out into the forest. Trees stood like sentinels, silent and cold. "If she's a rose," James whispered, "then I'm the damn gardener." The blizzard had returned to North Hollow with a vengeance. Snow whipped sideways in the wind, turning the pine forests into a labyrinth of white and gray. Flakes lashed against the windshield of the patrol truck as it crawled up the mountain road, chains clinking along its tires. The town had shut itself in, doors locked, chimneys lit, no one wandering the streets unless they had to. But James Walker wasn't a man who waited inside. Inside the truck, James sat between Deputy Glenn Rourke and another officer named Callie Harper, a young woman in her early 30s with short auburn hair and a lean, athletic build. Her uniform was crisp, her sidearms secure, and her green eyes held the kind of calm that came from having seen danger up close, but never backing away from it. She had served 2 tours as an MP overseas, and it showed in how she moved. No wasted steps, no unnecessary words. In the back, Shadow stood poised, eyes locked forward, fur bristling. His wounded leg, the bite wound from the Lasta encounter, had been stitched but not healed. Still he made no sound of pain, only patience. Rose was not with them. She was hidden safely at Helen Wilcox's cabin, tucked beneath layers of quilts, with a hunting rifle beside the door. Helen had promised to keep the fire lit, and James believed her. "We get one shot at this," Glenn said, his voice gruff but clear. He adjusted the brim of his sheriff's cap. "We catch them in the act. We get the kids. We shut the whole damn thing down." James nodded. "They're moving fast. They know we're watching now." "Then we move faster," Callie added, checking the safety on her rifle. They reached the edge of the tree line just as darkness began to fall. The old hunting lodge below was lit faintly, too many lights for an abandoned building. James raised his binoculars. 2 vans, 3 armed guards, movement inside. "Thermal says 6 heat signatures," Callie whispered, checking the tablet. James scanned the field again. "We go in quiet and get the kids first, then cut off the escape." Glenn gave a short nod. "Let's end this." They split into teams. Glenn and Callie approached from the north slope. James and Shadow took the eastern side, hugging the frozen ridge. Snow crunched underfoot, muffled by the blizzard. James's breath fogged against his scarf. Shadow stayed close, every muscle taut. Then it happened. A crack of gunfire, shouting, chaos. Glenn had moved too early. James didn't wait. He sprinted for the side door as Shadow lunged ahead. Inside they found the first of the smugglers, a skinny man with patchy facial hair and an assault rifle half raised. James knocked him flat with a blow from his rifle butt. Shadow surged past and vanished into the next room, barking fiercely. Gunshots rang through the walls. James ducked low, moving through dim corridors lined with old cots. In one room, 3 children huddled under a dirty blanket. He motioned for them to stay put. In the main hall, the firefight exploded. Callie took cover behind a tipped table, her rifle sharp and steady. Glenn shouted over the comms, "We've got 2 down! Room clear on the west end!" Then a scream, a child's voice. James turned. A man with a ski mask was dragging Rose by the wrist from the back doorway. James's heart stopped. She wasn't supposed to be here. Rose's face was pale, lips trembling, but her eyes burned. Shadow charged like a bullet, crossing the hall in seconds. The man turned, saw the dog, and raised his weapon too late. Shadow lunged, sinking his teeth into the man's thigh, pulling him down. The gun clattered to the floor. But then a second man stepped from the shadows, taller, broader, with a scar running down the left side of his face and a leather trench coat flapping in the wind. He raised a pistol and fired. The bullet struck Shadow in the side. The dog yelped and fell, legs scrambling against the wood floor. "No!" James shouted, firing twice. The scarred man ducked and fled out the back door. Rose dropped to her knees beside Shadow, tears flooding her face. Then the first man rose again, staggering, his leg bleeding. He grabbed Rose's arm, and then she screamed. Not a scream of fear, not a plea, a declaration. "I am Rose. I'm not afraid of you anymore." The words cut through the wind, the bullets, the night. James raised his rifle. One shot, one clean shot. The man fell. It took another 15 minutes for the scene to calm. The other suspects were arrested. Children were rescued. 8 of them in total. Glenn radioed for backup and paramedics. Callie sat against a wall, her hands shaking slightly, blood on her sleeve. James knelt beside Shadow, pressing a cloth to the wound. Rose crouched beside him, hands on the dog's chest, whispering. The snow outside fell heavier, now dyed faintly pink where it had blown inside. Shadow's eyes stayed open, alert, but pain was evident in every breath. "You saved her," James whispered, voice tight. The dog blinked once, and that was enough. The snow had softened in North Hollow, though the cold still lingered. The trees no longer groaned beneath ice, but stood quiet and still, as if watching over the forest that had borne witness to secrets too dark for daylight. The townspeople moved slower now, their eyes heavier, but a strange warmth had begun to creep into the edges of the cold. Perhaps it was the rescue, or perhaps it was the ripple left behind by a child who had survived the storm. In the days following the raid, news spread like wildfire. 8 children had been recovered from the forest compound, all of them under 10, some missing for weeks, others for months. The ring of kidnappers had operated across 3 counties, and the break in the case, sparked by James and Rose, gave law enforcement leads that led to even more rescues in nearby towns. James found himself suddenly visible again, not just as the strange man in the cabin or the ex-soldier with haunted eyes, but as something else, a protector, a man who had stepped forward when others didn't. But he didn't want the attention. He never had. Reporters called. The sheriff offered a ceremony. The mayor hinted at a medal. James refused them all. He spent his time at the clinic, where Shadow, stitched and bandaged, rested in a heated kennel. The dog was recovering slowly. His breathing was shallow but steady, and his eyes tracked James every time he entered the room. The vet, Doctor. Samuel Klein, a short, stocky man in his 60s, with silver hair and deep lines under his eyes, treated Shadow like royalty. A widower and former Navy medic, Dr. Klein had a gentle way about him. He spoke little, but when he looked at James, there was respect, the kind men exchanged without words. "You're lucky, Doctor," Klein said one evening. "A little higher and it would have torn through the lung." James nodded, rubbing Shadow's ear. He always knew how to take a hit for someone else. Meanwhile, Rose had been staying in a temporary shelter run by local volunteers. But today, 5 days after the rescue, something had changed. She had family. A match had been made through national missing persons databases. A woman named Marjorie Whitman, 72, had filed a report over a year ago about her missing daughter and granddaughter. The mother, Emily, now presumed dead, had disappeared with Rose on her way to stay at Marjorie's mountain cottage for the winter. They had never arrived. Marjorie came from North Dakota, a stooped woman with long silver hair braided down her back, sharp blue eyes, and skin like parchment that had spent too much time under the prairie sun. She wore a faded green wool coat and carried an old leather purse clutched tightly in both hands. When she stepped into the cabin where James and Rose waited, she didn't say a word at first. Rose looked up from the corner, hesitant. Marjorie crossed the room in 3 slow steps, then dropped to her knees with a groan. Her fingers touched Rose's cheek as if afraid she might vanish. "My baby," she whispered. "My sweet Rose." Rose didn't cry. She wrapped her arms around the old woman and pressed her face into the coat. James looked away. Later, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, casting long amber shadows over the snowbanks, Marjorie approached James near the porch. She stood tall now, though her shoulders shook. "You saved her," she said. "No," James replied. "She saved herself." Marjorie shook her head. "You don't understand. I prayed every night that someone would protect her. I just didn't know that someone would be you and that dog." James gave a faint smile. "He's more than a dog." Marjorie stepped forward, eyes glistening. Then, without warning, she hugged him. Her arms were frail, but the grip was firm. "Thank you," she said, "to both of you, from a mother and from a grandmother." Shadow barked softly from his spot near the cabin steps, tail thumping once. The next morning, Rose was set to leave with Marjorie. A county officer would escort them to the train station, where arrangements had been made for safe relocation and further therapy. James helped pack Rose's small things, the stuffed rabbit, some warm clothes, a drawing pad. As they prepared to load the car, Rose ran back inside the cabin, calling for him. "James!" He turned. She held out a small cloth pouch tied with red string. "I made something," she said, "with Dr. Klein and Miss Helen's help." Inside the pouch was a carved wooden pendant. It was rough but deliberate, the shape of a rose in bloom. Beneath the petals, etched with clumsy letters, were the words, "For Shadow, who kept the rose alive." James stared at it. His throat tightened. "He'll wear it when he's better," Rose said. James nodded, unable to speak. He knelt and pulled her into a hug. She whispered, "Tell him I'll be strong now. I'm not afraid." Then she climbed into the car. As it pulled away, Shadow limped to James's side and sat. They watched together until the car disappeared into the snow-dusted pines. The snow melted slowly that year in North Hollow. The forest, once cloaked in white, was now patchy with brown earth and new life. Green buds peeked shyly from the ends of skeletal branches, while shy crocuses poked up through thawed soil, like secrets finally given permission to breathe. The air still carried winter's bite, but the light, that golden, forgiving spring light, had returned. James Walker stood outside his cabin, a steaming mug of black coffee in one hand, the other buried in the thick fur of Shadow's neck. The dog sat by his side, wearing a leather collar with a wooden pendant carved in the shape of a rose, a gift too sacred to be hidden. Shadow's wound had healed into a scar running along his shoulder, a line of memory carved into muscle. But it hadn't slowed him down. At 40, James looked older than his age, not from the years, but from the weight they carried. His face had grown softer since the snowstorm, less armored, though the edge in his eyes never fully dulled. He wore the same olive jacket he'd had since Kandahar, now stitched and patched in several places, and boots still bearing salt lines from winter. He whistled low. Shadow's ears perked up. Together they began their morning walk along the forest path behind the cabin, where snow lingered in the shadows, but sunlight had begun to weave gold into the trees. Birds returned in ones and twos, brave scouts of spring. A few miles in, they reached their usual spot, a hilltop clearing with a view of the valley below. James sat on a log, one Shadow had claimed years ago, and reached into his coat pocket. Inside was a small envelope, edges worn from how often he'd opened it. The handwriting was uneven, large letters pressed deep into the paper as if written with all the strength in a small hand. He unfolded the letter again, slowly, reverently. "Dear Mr. James, it's me, Rose. I live with Grandma now. We have a garden and 2 cats, and sometimes I help her feed birds. I'm growing up. I go to school and I laugh more now. Sometimes I even dance in the snow when it falls. But I remember the cabin and your dog. Shadow is the best name ever. I remember you making fire and soup and being quiet but kind. I remember you saying, 'If she's a rose, then I'm the gardener.' So I want to say this. Thank you. Thank you for being my gardener. If you ever find someone left behind in the snow, someone who's scared or small or quiet, please help them like you helped me. Sometimes all it takes is a dog, and a quiet man who knows how to love. Love Rose P.S. Tell Shadow. I love him very much." James read the letter twice more, then folded it and returned it to his pocket. He leaned back, arms draped over his knees, and watched Shadow nose through thawing leaves. The dog paused, looked up at him, as if he could hear the echo of Rose's voice. "Yeah," James said softly. "She's something." Shadow huffed and lay down beside him, placing his head on James's boot. They sat like that a long time. Later that afternoon, James visited the sheriff's office. Sheriff Linda Gable was a sturdy woman in her early 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled into a low ponytail, and a voice that could silence a bar room. She had known James for years, back when he still wore the uniform and hadn't yet grown quiet. "You ever think about coming back?" she asked, sipping from a mug that said, "Coffee is my deputy." James shook his head. "Too many ghosts." Linda nodded. "Fair. Still, we could use someone like you. Maybe not full-time. Maybe just someone to talk to kids when things go bad." James considered that. Not for himself, but maybe for Rose, for what she'd become, because someone had stayed. "I'll think about it." When he returned to the cabin, Shadow was already waiting near the steps, tail wagging slow and steady. That night, James built a fire and sat by it, scratching Shadow's ears as the flames danced. On the mantel hung the Rose pendant. Above it, a new photo. Rose in a red coat, missing a tooth, holding a kitten with fierce protectiveness. She had sent it with the letter. Outside, frost gathered on the windows. But inside, the warmth held. And for the first time in years, James fell asleep without waking in terror. Sometimes all it takes is one quiet man, one loyal dog, and one fragile voice whispering, "I am Rose," to remind us that God still moves through snowstorms, through scars, and through strangers. When the world seems too cold, too silent, maybe the Lord sends us a shadow to protect the Rose we didn't know we were guarding. Maybe grace arrives not with trumpets, but with paw prints in the snow. This is more than just a story. It's a prayer for every child still waiting to be found, a reminder that love, even buried under years of grief, can bloom again. If this story touched your heart, share it. Leave a comment for someone who might need a little light today. Subscribe to the channel so more souls can be reminded. Miracles still happen. And tonight, may God bless you, your loved ones, and every shadow watching over you. Amen.